The wind over the northern seas has a voice. It carries the sound of oars, the crack of ice, and the laughter of women whose names have drifted between history and legend. You have heard of them, shield maidens who stood beside men in battle, queens who ruled from timber halls, witches who whispered to gods that no one else dared to name. Yet somewhere between truth and song, between the ink of chroniclers and the breath of skalds, the question lingers: were Viking women truly as fearless as the legends claim? To ask this question is to step into a landscape carved by extremes. The Norse world of the late 8th to 11th centuries was one of cold seas, long winters, and fragile harvests. Fearlessness was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Every soul, man or woman, lived with the knowledge that a wrong tide, a poor yield, or a wounded leader could unravel a life in a heartbeat. In that crucible of survival, courage was not born in the battlefield, it was forged in daily endurance. The first storytellers, the skalds, wrapped that endurance in song. They painted women with voices sharp as spears, hearts hard as oak, and wills as steady as the keel of a longship. To them, a fearless woman was not a rarity. She was a reflection of the northern world itself, unforgiving, beautiful, and unbroken. But centuries later, when Christian monks set quill to parchment, those same women became curiosities. The shield maidens were called strange or unnatural. The priestesses who read the wind were branded witches. The independence of Norse women was rewritten as myth, and yet traces remain. They lie buried engraved beneath the birch trees of Birka, in the iron keys found at women's belts, in the sagas whispered across the hearth fire. Every key, every rune, every law carved in wood tells a fragment of the truth that the fearlessness of Viking women was real, but not always loud. It was in the way they ruled their households while men were away, the way they managed trade, spoke in councils, and held their gods accountable through ritual. To live as a woman in the north was to balance steel and silence. Imagine her for a moment, a woman standing at the edge of a fjord at dawn, the cold biting through her cloak. Behind her, the hall is quiet, children asleep, smoke still coiling from the hearth. Ahead, her husband's ship drifts into mist, its dragon-headed prow cutting through the waves. She does not cry out. She watches, memorizing the tilt of the sail. In her hand, she holds the household keys, symbols of her authority and burden. In his absence, she becomes both ruler and guardian. Fear will visit her often, but it will not stay. That, more than any sword or shield, is her courage. Fearlessness in the Viking world did not mean recklessness. It meant the refusal to bow before despair. A man who died with a sword in hand could claim a place in Valhalla. But what of the woman who faced childbirth without medicine, famine without escape, loneliness without comfort? Her victories were quieter, but no less divine. The sagas speak of women who avenged murders, who dictated the fates of clans, who dared to divorce men unworthy of them. They also tell of those who defied kings, who sailed with raiding crews disguised as men, or who met death with open eyes. Each story adds another thread to the tapestry of their defiance. Archaeology now gives voice to what the sagas only hinted at. In the grave known as BJ 581, near the Swedish town of Birka, bones once assumed to belong to a man were revealed to be those of a woman, a warrior buried with sword, axe, spear, and 2 horses. For over a century, scholars refused to believe the evidence, arguing that she must have been a widow, a symbolic burial, a mistake. But the truth, tested in DNA and iron, held firm. She was a warrior, and she had been honored as one. Fearless not in legend, but in life. Still, fearlessness is not always heroic. Some women wielded it as cruelty, others as cunning. The sagas remember Gunhild, Queen of Norway, who commanded assassins and sorcery with equal poise. They remember Ljotha, who fought in Ragnar Lothbrok's ranks, and whose enemies feared her more than the sea. They remember Freydis, Eirik's daughter, who crossed the ocean to Vinland and slaughtered her rivals under the pale light of a foreign dawn. To modern eyes, they bore the line between hero and villain. To the Norse mind, that line barely existed. Strength was virtue, weakness sin. To understand their fearlessness, you must strip away the modern gaze. These women did not fight for equality, they lived within a world that demanded capability. The law codes of Iceland allowed women to inherit, to divorce, to own property rights that many European women would not share for centuries. But those rights came with danger. A woman could call for vengeance. She could also become the reason for it. A careless word could ignite a blood feud that spanned generations. To live in such a society was to hold one's dignity as both shield and weapon. Fearlessness, then, was not about absence of fear, it was about mastery over it. The Viking world was built on uncertainty. The sea could rise, the gods could betray, the plan could turn. To remain steady in that storm required a spirit that refused to bend. The Norse even had a word for such strength, hugr, the soul's courage, the inner fire that defined a person's fate. To have a strong hugr was to walk through the world without yielding to its chaos. And in saga after saga, women are praised for their hugr as often as men. One could say that fearlessness was the currency of the North. It was traded in every oath, every voyage, every act of endurance. It was the language of survival. To live in such a place was to be constantly tested by the sea, by winter, by one's own people. And yet, time and again, the stories return to women who met those tests with an iron calm. When men sailed for war, they kept the farms alive. When winter starved the land, they rationed and prayed. When feuds broke, they became arbiters and avengers. They held the threads of fate together when the world seemed ready to tear apart. That is why the question remains so potent. The image of the fearless Viking woman endures not because it flatters, but because it feels earned. It speaks to something universal, the strength to endure what cannot be changed, and to shape what can. The old myths may exaggerate their deeds, but they do not invent their spirit. The sagas are not just stories of gods and kings, they are archives of human resilience, written in the rhythm of survival. And so, as the wind still combs the fjords, and the sea remembers every name, the question becomes not whether Viking women were fearless, but what kind of fearlessness they possessed. Was it the defiance of the shield maiden, or the quiet resolve of the matron, the wild freedom of the seeress, or the steady faith of the farmer's wife? Perhaps all of these and more. In the North, courage was not a single face. It was 1,000 faces, lit by firelight, reflected in ice. The truth lies somewhere between history and legend, in the silence that follows the last line of a saga. There, in that space, we meet them again, women who lived without asking permission from fear, who ruled without crowns, who shaped a civilization of storms and stories. Their names may fade, their bones may rest beneath cold earth, but their echo endures. It whispers still in the wind that sweeps across the old Viking lands, asking the question that no historian can truly answer. Were they fearless, or were they simply free? Before one can understand the spirit of Viking women, their fearlessness, their endurance, their place in both home and myth, one must first understand the world that shaped them. The Norse lands were not merely a setting, they were a crucible. Harsh, magnificent, and indifferent, they carved courage out of those who survived beneath their endless skies. The Norse world stretched like a tapestry across the cold edges of Europe, from the fjords of Norway to the green fields of Denmark, from the forests of Sweden to the black volcanic plains of Iceland. Beyond those lands, the Northmen ventured outward across the North Sea to the British Isles, through rivers to the Slavic lands, down to Byzantium, even across the Atlantic to Vinland. The women of these journeys, though rarely named, walked the same paths. They carried the North with them wherever they went, its frost woven into their bones. Life here was not gentle. The winters were long and the summers brief, a rush of green before the cold returned. The soil could be stingy, the sea cruel. Yet there was beauty in it, to the kind that demanded reverence. The northern sun could turn an ocean into silver, a birch forest into flame. Every breath of wind was thick with salt, with pine, with the scent of something older than memory. It was this world that gave birth to the Norse mind, a mind that saw both beauty and death as part of the same design. The people of the North did not see themselves as separate from their world. They lived in conversation with it. The sea was a god, the thunder a voice, the mountain a keeper of secrets. And among these forces stood women, not as mere witnesses, but as interpreters. When the storms came, it was often women who read their signs. When the seasons shifted, women who marked the turning of time through weaving, cooking, healing, and song. The domestic sphere, though small in appearance, was cosmic in meaning. The home was a mirror of the world, its fire a sun, its walls the edges of the universe. To the Norse, every act had spiritual weight. When a woman spun thread, she was echoing the Norns, those ancient weavers of fate who sat beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree. When she prepared a meal, she honored Freya, goddess of fertility and passion. When she gave birth, she walked the same dangerous road that led warriors to Valhalla, for both paths were perilous. Both ended in blood, in pain, and sometimes in glory. It is said that the Norse did not fear death because they had already made peace with it. Life was too uncertain to cling to. Instead, they clung to honor, a word that bound their world together like sinew. Honor was more than reputation. It was one's worth in the eyes of gods and kin. A man could lose his farm, a woman her husband, but if they lost honor, they lost everything. Fearlessness, then, was not an abstract virtue. It was a duty, a shield against shame. For the woman who held her household's honor in her hands, every decision mattered: what she said, what she endured, what she refused to forgive. Picture a Viking settlement. Low wooden halls ringed by fields, smoke rising from peat fires, children chasing geese between fences. The mountains loom behind, dark and immense. Beyond them, the sea stretches outward like a second sky. In the center of it all, a longhouse glows with firelight. Inside, the air hums with life, the smell of meat and mead, the creak of benches, the quiet authority of a woman moving between the hearth and the high seat. She wears her keys at her belt, their clink marking her status. The keys are not symbolic alone, they open storerooms, chests, the very wealth of the household. In her hands rests not only the survival of her family, but the rhythm of the world within those walls. To outsiders, her life might seem confined, but within that hall, she commands a realm as complex and demanding as any battlefield. She knows the trade routes, the lineage of every servant, the herbs that heal, the laws that bind. She knows when to be gentle and when to be iron. Her eyes have seen storms tear roofs apart, raiders set fire to barns, children buried before their first spring. Yet she wakes each day to start the fire again. In that repetition lies the core of Norse resilience. To endure is to conquer. Above her, the gods watch, ancient, wild, and human in their flaws. Odin, one-eyed seeker of knowledge. Thor, protector of mankind. Freya, fierce and wise, goddess of love and battle both. Loki, the trickster who reminds all that chaos is never far away. The sagas say the gods themselves could not escape fate, that even they feared Ragnarok, the world's fiery end. If the gods could face doom with laughter, why should mortals do less? That was the Norse creed, and women lived it as fully as men. The myths granted women a strange equality. Freya's chariot was drawn by cats, yet she received half the fallen warriors from battlefields equal to Odin himself. Skadi, goddess of winter and the hunt, demanded justice for her father's death, and chose her own husband from among the gods. Even Hel, ruler of the underworld, was a woman, a reminder that power was not confined to light nor fear to men. These divine figures mirrored mortal women, caretakers and destroyers, lovers and avengers, givers of life and guardians of death. The Norse world, for all its hardness, was deeply poetic. It understood that fearlessness was not brute strength alone, it was harmony with fate. The sagas often speak of word, destiny woven like cloth. You could not unweave it, but you could choose how to face it. The fearless woman did not deny her fate. She met it head on, eyes open. If sorrow came, she bore it. If vengeance was needed, she demanded it. If joy found her, she savored it without guilt. To the Norse, to live honestly with one's fate was the highest form of courage. In the silence of the northern night, when the aurora danced across the sky like a river of ghosts, the old people would tell stories. The children would listen, eyes wide, to tales of gods and heroes, of love and betrayal. But among them were quieter tales of women who spoke with spirits, who outwitted kings, who kept their clans alive through the famine of long winters. These were not warriors in the usual sense, yet they were the spine of their world. Without them, the legends would have crumbled to ash. It is easy to see why later generations romanticized Viking men, their ships, their raids, their conquests. But the true endurance of Norse culture lay not in steel, but in structure. While the men ventured into the unknown, it was women who ensured there was something worth returning to. They guarded the hearth, the faith, the continuity of the clan. Their courage was not sung in battlefields but lived in years of survival. The land taught them this courage. The mountains did not forgive mistakes. The sea did not explain itself. And the gods, though mighty, offered no promises. To live here was to live with uncertainty as constant companion. Yet out of that uncertainty came a philosophy of fierce acceptance. The Norse did not ask for safety, they asked for strength. In their world, to be fearless did not mean to escape fear, but to walk beside it. So, when we speak of Viking women as fearless, it is not only the image of the shield maiden that matters. It is the mother who buries a child and lights the hearth again, the widow who takes up her husband's trade and refuses to beg, the seeress who speaks truths that men dare not hear, the young girl who dreams not of marriage, but of freedom on the open sea. All are born of the same land, the land that turns fear into faith, hardship into identity. In the Norse world, survival itself was a kind of holiness. Every dawn was a victory, every harvest aid. And if the world should one day burn, as the poet said it would, the Northmen believed something would rise again from the ashes, a green shoot, a new beginning, for that was the promise of their world, that nothing endures forever, but courage endures enough. The Norse woman, standing beneath that cold, immortal sky, understood this better than anyone. She did not seek immortality in story or song. She sought it in the rhythm of her labor, the warmth of her fire, the love she left behind. The land would remember her, as it remembers all who stood unbroken against its wind. In the heartbeat of the North, where gods and humans shared the same horizon, fearlessness was not legend, it was law. The story of a Viking woman's fearlessness begins long before she wields keys or commands a hall. It begins in childhood among frost and fire, hunger and laughter, danger and tenderness. The Norse world raised its daughters not as fragile beings, but as small survivors of a vast, indifferent land. To grow up here was to learn early that strength was not a choice. It was the price of staying alive. The first cry of a newborn girl echoed against timber walls thick with smoke. Her mother's breath was still shallow from the pain of birth, her hands red from the effort. Round the hearth, midwives murmured prayers to Frigg, protector of mothers, and sometimes to Freya, who guided women through both love and death. The air smelled of blood and wood ash, of old straw and burning resin. Life and death were never far apart. Every birth balanced between them. A healthy child was a blessing, a promise that the family line would continue. Yet not all were kept. In a world of scarcity, where winters devoured grain and mouths alike, families sometimes made choices that would chill later centuries. A weak child might be left outside to the cold, a cruel necessity rather than a crime. It was not indifference, but the grim arithmetic of survival. Those who lived because the fates allowed it, because the gods had not yet turned their faces away. Thus, from the very first breath, a Viking child was a testament to endurance. The first years were spent close to the hearth. The hall was the universe. Walls of rough-hewn timber, smoke curling to the rafters, the hum of daily work around her. She learned by watching her mother's steady hands at the loom, her father mending a net, her older brothers sharpening iron. The hall taught more than words. It taught silence when the men discussed raids, patience when the fire burned low, alertness to the moods that passed like weather across her mother's face. By the age of 5, a girl might already carry small tasks. She fetched water from the well, fed hens, gathered kindling from the forest's edge. If she tripped or dropped her load, no one scolded her harshly. They expected her to fall and to rise. To be Norse was to fail and to stand again. Fear was not something to be banished, it was something to be worn until it fit like a second skin. The landscape itself was a teacher. When the wind screamed over the fjords, the children learned to hold their cloaks tighter, to lean into the gust instead of away from it. When the tide went out, they hunted for shellfish among the rocks. When winter buried the world in white, they listened to stories of gods and giants, fire and ice. The land was both cradle and test. It gave lessons in scarcity, in patience, and the beauty of small victories. Girls were not raised apart from the rhythms of danger. They watched as men sharpened their blades before sailing, saw the way mothers hid their grief behind a calm face. They understood that love was often laced with loss. Their dolls, carved from driftwood or bone, were dressed like women wearing tiny cloaks, belts with keys, the emblems of adulthood. Even play carried prophecy. To nurture, to command, to endure. Education came not from parchment but from memory. The sagas, though later written by men, were carried first by the mouths of women. Mothers and grandmothers were the keepers of words. Round the fire, they recited tales of gods and heroes, but also of clever women, those who outwitted trolls, who prophesied doom, who made kings tremble with their speech. Each story was a lesson hidden in wonder. Wit is sharper than steel, silence can be as deadly as a sword. By adolescence, a girl already knew her worth. She could milk cows, churn butter, weave cloth, brew ale, tend herbs, and negotiate small trades. She also knew the law, what she could claim, what she could lose. In Icelandic law, a woman had rights of inheritance and could demand divorce if mistreated. These were not privileges but protections in a world of shifting loyalties. To be fearless was not to fight without fear, but to understand one's power and boundaries within the fabric of the law. Her body, too, was a tool and a mystery. When her first blood came, it was not whispered away in shame but marked as a turning point. The older women would tell her that she now walked between worlds, between life and death, between mortal and divine. Childbirth was near enough to dying that both were considered sacred. To bring life into the world was to risk one's own, and thus womanhood was seen as its own kind of valor. In some families, daughters were taught to handle knives, to ride horses, even to draw a bow. This was especially true in the frontier settlements of Iceland and Greenland, where isolation made everyone a warrior in some sense. The sagas tell of girls who defended their homes against raiders while their fathers were away. One such tale speaks of a young woman, Astrid, who stood in her doorway with a spear and shouted curses at the men who sought to burn her hall. The story ends with her alive and the raiders dead. Whether true or not, it carried the message that courage was not confined to men. In the evenings, as dusk stretched across the sky and the sea turned black, she might sit beside her mother and weave. The loom sang softly with each stroke of the shuttle. The cloth grew beneath their hands, a living map of time. Weaving was no mere chore, it was creation. Each thread carried meaning, each pattern a story. In her hands the girl learned patience, precision, and a strange, sacred rhythm, the rhythm of the world's making. As she grew, she began to sense the invisible web that bound everything together: the gods, the land, the family, the self. The Norse called this word the pattern of fate. It could not be escaped, only understood. The wise learned to read it like weather, to bend without breaking. This was the secret her mother passed to her, not in words but in example. When disaster struck, when cattle died or men did not return from sea, her mother did not wail. She acted. She gathered, mended, planned. That was the model of courage, not denial, but adaptation. The girl's sense of self was thus tempered in hardship and myth alike. She was told that inside every person burned a Huger soul force, a will. It could grow weak through cowardice or strong through trials. To nurture her Huger was to strengthen her destiny. By the time she reached marriageable age, she would already have lived a lifetime of winters, labors, and lessons. Her face might still be young, but her eyes had learned the ancient wisdom of the North, that the gods favored those who did not flinch. When she stepped into adulthood, when the keys were placed at her belt and the hearth fire became hers, the transformation was not sudden. It was the completion of a long apprenticeship in endurance. She had learned to read the moods of men, the signs of weather, the patterns of sickness and growth. She had seen the thin line between survival and ruin, and she knew how to walk it. Her courage was quiet, disciplined, shaped by years of small acts that built the foundation of her world. The fearlessness of Viking women was not born in battle. It was bred in the hall, in the fields, and the moments when no one was watching. It began in the eyes of the girl who stared down the winter wind and did not turn away. It grew in the hands that spun wool for her brother's sails, in the heart that learned both tenderness and defiance. From such daughters of ice and iron came the women whose names would echo in the sagas. They were not made by legend, they made legend possible. For only those who had conquered childhood in the North could stand unbroken before the storms of life. And so, before the shield maidens, before the queens and the witches, there were little girls beneath the northern sky, learning how to be fearless long before anyone called them brave. By the time you reached womanhood in the Viking Age, your hands already bore the quiet marks of labor and life. Calluses from the loom, faint scars from the knife, the memory of endless winters etched into your skin. But with maturity came something more visible, more symbolic, the keys. They hung from your belt, small and metallic, their jingle both ordinary and profound. In those keys lay authority, the right to command the household, to guard its wealth, to sustain its fire. To outsiders, it might seem domestic, even mundane. But in the Norse world, the hearth was not merely a place of warmth. It was the heart of survival. The woman who ruled it wielded power as ancient as the gods. When men sailed into the horizon to trade, raid, or die, it was you who kept the world intact. You did not hold a sword, yet your hands determined whether a family line continued or vanished. The longhouse was your realm. It stretched like a wooden ship turned upside down, its ribs of timber, its breath smoke and fire. By day you managed its rhythm. You ordered servants, directed work, supervised stores of grain, fish, and salted meat. You knew precisely how long the larder could last, how many mouths it could feed. You calculated survival with an accuracy born of hunger. You were also the healer. Your knowledge of herbs, poultices, and charms was not written in any book, but passed from woman to woman through gestures, whispers, and the weight of experience. Birch sap for wounds, juniper smoke to cleanse the air, seaweed to stave off illness. You were midwife, doctor, priestess. When a birth went wrong, you commanded the room with steady hands and iron voice. You knew how close life and death could kiss, and you had met them both enough times to fear neither. And when the men returned from the sea, whether with silver or sorrow, you greeted them not as servants, but as equals. The sagas tell of women who welcomed warriors home with both tenderness and judgment. They inspected the spoils, questioned the tales, weighed truth against boasting. For you were the keeper of lineage, the memory of the hall. You remembered who owed what, who broke oaths, who still had debts unpaid. Memory was your weapon, sharper than steel. Marriage itself was a contract of property and alliance, but also a test of character. You had the right to divorce a husband who failed to provide, who dishonored you, or who proved violent beyond reason. The law carved in wood and sung by law speakers acknowledged your standing. You could inherit land, manage estates, and even appear at the Thing's assembly through your kin or advocates. But your real influence lived in subtler spaces in speech, in story and silence. Viking women were famed for their forliker, their knowledge. In the evenings, when the hearth fire painted faces in gold, it was you who wove the sagas of gods and ancestors. You reminded your sons of their bloodlines, your daughters of their duty, your husband of his promises. You shaped the minds of the next generation with words that were both warning and blessing. In this, you echoed the goddesses themselves. Frigg, who saw all fates but spoke none. Freya, who commanded life and death with equal grace. The Disir ancestral spirits who guarded families and guided destiny. When you sat beside the fire and watched the shadows flicker, you were part of that lineage of divine keepers. The hall was your temple, the fire your sacred flame. Fearlessness in this world did not roar, it endured. It woke before dawn to milk the cows in frost so thick the world seemed carved from ice. It faced childbirth without promise of survival. It carried grief silently when a husband did not return from sea, when sons went to war. You did not cry before others. Instead, you wove his memory into a cloak, sang his deeds into a lullaby, and taught your children to be strong. There were moments, too, when your strength was tested by more than hunger or grief, when the hall was threatened, when raiders came or feud erupted. It was not unheard of for a woman to defend her home. The sagas speak of Halgerd Longlegs, whose pride and cunning sparked bloodshed, of Bergthora, wife of Jul, who refused to flee her burning house. Their stories are complex, both admired and condemned, but always they stand as proof that women were never powerless. Even in peace, your decisions ripple far beyond the hearth. You arranged marriages, negotiated trade, sent messages across fjords. You decided which alliances would shape the future. Your advice was sought in councils and whispered over mead cups. Men might hold the sword, but women held the thread that tied one generation to the next. At night, when the house slept and only the fire remained awake, you sometimes felt the weight of solitude. The keys at your belt were heavy not with metal but with meaning. They opened storerooms, yes, but also the hidden chambers of life itself: birth, death, remembrance, legacy. In your quiet, you were more than a wife or mother. You were a guardian of continuity in a world built on uncertainty. When storms howled outside, you walked from bed to bed, checking each sleeping child, feeding the embers, listening to the old timbers creak. You thought of your mother, who had done the same, and of your daughter, who one day would take your keys. The cycle of womanhood was endless, like the spinning of the Norns who wove fate at the roots of Yggdrasil. In this eternal motion, your fearlessness was not an act but a state of being. It was born of knowledge, not of defiance. You understood how fragile life was, and yet you lived fully within that fragility. You were not shielded from suffering, but shaped by it. You did not seek glory in battle. Your victories were quieter, deeper: the full barns before winter, the child who survived fever, the family name spoken with honor long after your death. To be a Viking woman was to master endurance in every form. You commanded not armies, but time. You bent fate to the rhythm of your will. The men's sagas may fill pages with blood and steel, but the silent saga of the women, the keepers of fire, of memory, of keys, is the one that held the world together. And so, as dawn approached again, as frost traced the window slits of your hall, you rose before the sun. The fire had dimmed but not died. You knelt to feed it, coaxing flame from ember, whispering to it like an old friend. Outside, the sea moaned against the shore. Inside, the keys chimed softly at your waist, announcing that the heart of the North still beat and that you were its keeper. Not all Viking women stayed by the hearth. Some stepped beyond the threshold and into legend, into the realm of blood and battle, of spears and storms. These were the Skjaldmr, the Shield Maidens. Their existence has long been debated by scholars and doubted by skeptics, but their presence in the sagas, in runes, and even in graves unearthed by modern archaeologists tells a story too persistent to dismiss. Whether in flesh or in myth, The image of the fearless woman who fought beside men was carved deep into the northern soul. Imagine her, standing at the edge of a fjord at dawn, the wind tangling her hair, the cold biting her cheeks. Round her, men adjust their mail, test the edges of their swords. But her gaze is steady, her breath calm. She is no longer daughter or wife or mother. She is a weapon tempered by the same elements that forged the mountains. Her story begins not in rebellion against men, but in devotion to fate. The Norse believed that courage was a duty to oneself and to the gods. Odin, god of wisdom and war, chose the brave for Valhalla regardless of birth. In that creed, there was space, however narrow, for a woman who refused to stay behind. The sagas remember some by name. Lagertha, who rode into battle with her hair unbound, leading warriors against the Swedish king who had slain her husband. Hervor, daughter of the doomed warrior Angantyr, who sailed to the haunted island of her father's burial to claim his cursed sword. Turfing, when his ghost warned her to flee, she only laughed and demanded the weapon. Her courage was so fierce that even the dead obeyed. There was also Freydis, Eirik's daughter of Eric the Red, who sailed to Vinland, the New World, and fought alongside men when their camp was attacked by natives. When others fled, she seized a sword from a fallen warrior, bared her breast, and struck the blade against it, screaming her defiance. The attackers fled, believing her touched by madness or divine wrath. In her wild courage, one sees the essence of Viking fearlessness, a refusal to yield, even when defeat is certain. For every saga heroine, there were countless unnamed women who defended their homes when the men were gone. The frontier settlements demanded strength from all. In Iceland and Greenland, raids were rare but not unknown in those moments. The women who could wield a spear did so without hesitation. Their bravery may not have filled songs, but it filled generations with survival. Modern archaeology has begun to reveal what stories hinted at for centuries. In 2017, the remains of a warrior buried in Birka, Sweden, a grave long assumed to belong to a man, were confirmed by DNA analysis to be female. She had been buried with weapons, 2 horses, and gaming pieces, suggesting a strategist, a leader. The discovery shook old assumptions. Perhaps the sagas were not exaggeration after all. Perhaps some women truly did live and die as warriors. But whether she rode to war or guarded her hall, the Viking woman's courage was of the same essence. It was not merely physical valor, it was a spiritual defiance against limitation. The warrior and the weaver both faced their fates with the same unblinking gaze. One met death on the field, the other in childbirth or famine. Both stood before the same indifferent gods. The Shield Maiden's life was a paradox admired, yet feared. Her power disturbed the balance of a patriarchal world even as it fascinated it. Men sang of her, but few would wed her. To be a woman who fought was to cross the boundary between mortal and mythic. She embodied both creation and destruction, life and death, the dual nature of Freya herself. When the host marched to battle, the Skjaldmur rode among them not as ornament, but as omen. Her shield bore the symbols of protection: ravens, serpents, runes carved to bind fear. She fought not for plunder or pride, but for something deeper, for the right to exist beyond the walls others built. Each stroke of her sword was a cry for remembrance, a demand that history not forget that women, too, had stood beneath the storm. In the chaos of combat, amid the clash of iron and the cries of the dying, there was no room for doubt. As Shield Maiden learned that courage was not the absence of fear but mastery of it. The sagas described them with awe. They fought like wolves gone mad, and the ground ran red beneath their feet. Whether truth or poetry, the image endures because it speaks to a timeless truth: the human spirit's refusal to be caged. And yet, when the battle ended, and the ravens descended, the Shield Maiden's tale did not always end in glory. Some were slain and buried nameless. Others laid down their arms and returned to the loom, their deeds fading into whispers. But even then, they carried within them the quiet fire of those who had looked death in the eye and did not blink. The Norse saw life as a tapestry woven by three sisters, the Norns, at the roots of Yggdrasil. Each thread, each fate, was unique. The shield maidens were threads of iron woven among softer fibers, adding strength to the whole. They proved that destiny did not belong to men alone. When poets sang of them by firelight, they did not sing of conquest but of courage. They told of women who chose their own fate, who met the storm not as victims, but as equals. The sagas made them immortal not because they were flawless, but because they were fearless. And so, in the long echo of centuries, their image endures. A woman with wine-tangled hair, a shield in her hand, and a gaze fixed on the horizon. She is not a fantasy. She is a memory of what courage once meant. For in every woman who dares, who endures, who defies, the spirit of the shield maiden still breathes. Long before the cross came to the north, before Latin prayers and church bells subdued the wild rhythm of the old world, there were women who walked between the seen and the unseen. They were called Velur, Seekener, and Spakenor prophetesses, witches, and seers. To the Vikings, they were not outcasts but necessary vessels of the divine. If the shield maiden carried courage into battle, the seeress carried it into the darkness of the soul. The Vaelva stood apart from ordinary women. Her presence was both revered and unsettling, for she dealt not in the world of men but in the will of the gods. Draped in dark robes, adorned with beads of amber and jet, she carried a staff carved with symbols and crowned with iron. The staff was her mark of office, a bridge between earth and spirit. When she walked into a hall, people rose in silence. Children hid behind their mothers. The air thickened, as though time itself held its breath. You, had you lived in that world, might have seen one arrive on a cold winter night. The fire crackled as she entered, frost clinging to her cloak. Her eyes pale, distant, seemed to look through walls and bone alike. She accepted food and warmth, then sat at the center of the hall as if it were her rightful throne. Soon the women gathered around her, chanting ancient songs, their voices weaving a sound older than speech. Sire, the magic she practiced was not the thunderous sorcery of men but the subtle weaving of destiny. It was the art of seeing what others could not, reading omens in smoke, whispers in wind, symbols in the flight of birds. She could foretell a chieftain's death, bless a voyage, or curse an enemy so that sickness clung to him like shadow. In the sagas, kings themselves sought her counsel, and warriors trembled before her words. Yet her power was double-edged. The same sire that could heal could also unravel. The same wisdom that blessed a home could doom it. To know too much of fate was to risk being devoured by it. The Vaelva lived at the edge of the world, and of sanity a vessel for powers that even the gods approached with caution. Odin himself had learned sire from Freya, goddess of love and death, and was mocked for practicing what was considered a woman's art. But Odin knew what others feared, that the threads of destiny were spun by feminine hands. The Vaelva's rituals were acts of transformation. She entered trance through song and rhythm, her spirit wandering beyond the body. The women who sang for her Spakenor kept her anchored, their voices forming a net between worlds. In her vision she might see the shadows of coming wars, the rise and fall of kings, the deaths of unborn children. She might see the world itself ending in flames at Ragnarok, and yet she would return calm, unshaken. To know the end of all things and still live, that was fearlessness beyond battle. In a society that prized strength of arm, the Vaelva embodied another kind of power, knowledge. Her authority came not from violence but from vision. She could command warriors without lifting a blade. She could bring peace between feuding clans with a single prophecy or ignite bloodshed with a curse. Her wisdom was feared because it was uncontainable. And yet, not all women of magic were distant or feared. Many practiced smaller, humbler arts in their homes. Charms for fertility, runes for protection, herbs to soothe pain or bring sleep. They whispered to the household spirits, left offerings at sacred groves, and spoke to the dead in dreams. Magic was not separate from life, it was its secret language. To bake bread, to weave cloth, to give birth, all were acts of power. The gods lived in every gesture, every breath. But when Christianity came, the old balance began to fracture. The priest saw witchcraft where the ancestors had seen wisdom. The sacred staff became a symbol of heresy, and the songs of the Sire turned into whispers of sin. The fearless women who had once guided kings now found themselves hunted or silenced. Yet even as churches rose, the memory of the Vailva did not die. Her spirit sank deep into the soil of the north, hiding in lullabies, in folk tales, in the instinctive reverence women still held for the unseen. There is something haunting in the story of the Vailva. She represents the paradox of Viking womanhood itself. Revered yet feared, powerful yet vulnerable, central yet peripheral. She stands as the embodiment of knowledge that cannot be controlled. The sagas describe her walking alone across frozen moors, her cloak billowing like storm clouds, her staff marking the snow. Men would stop their work to watch her pass, whispering prayers to keep her gaze from lingering too long. To be her was to live without protection, but also without chains. She belonged to no man, no clan, no law. Her loyalty was to truth, however cruel. In her fearlessness, there was melancholy, the price of seeing too clearly. She bore the weight of the world's secrets in silence. When she spoke, her words could bless or break, but they were always believed. Even now, her shadow lingers in the northern imagination. The wise woman, the witch, the midwife, the grandmother who just knows they are her descendants. They carry her calm, her danger, her compassion. Every act of intuition, every defiance of reason in the name of life, is a spark of her ancient flame. In the end, the Vailva is not just a figure of the past but a mirror for the present. Her power came from listening to the wind, the earth, the heart. She reminds us that fearlessness is not only in battle but in understanding, in facing what is hidden, in daring to see the truth of things. As the sagas say, wisdom is won from pain and vision from loss. The Vailva knew this better than any. Her path was lonely, but her courage illuminated the dark. And long after her staff has turned to dust, her spirit still walks the northern nights, an eternal witness to the strength of women who refuse to fear what they were meant to be. In the sagas of the north, wars are fought with swords, but the true empires are built with words, alliances, and lineage. If the Viking man's world was measured in miles of sea and steel, the Viking woman's domain was measured in generations, threads of blood, and promise woven across time. Her power did not gleam in sunlight. It shimmered quietly beneath the surface of every oath, every marriage, every feast. To understand how Viking women wielded influence, one must first understand honor, the heartbeat of Norse society. Honor, or drengskaper, was not simply pride or reputation. It was the invisible currency of survival, binding families, defining status, shaping fate. For men, it was proven through battle and oath. For women, it was maintained through wisdom, dignity, and loyalty, and sometimes through vengeance. When you were born into a Viking household, you were born not as an individual but as part of a lineage. Your ancestors' names were spoken with reverence, their deeds recited beside the fire. Your duty was not only to live well but to live in such a way that your descendants could speak your name without shame. This was your first lesson in power, that memory itself was authority. Women were the guardians of that memory. They remembered the tangled roots of kinship, who had wronged whom, which debts remained unpaid, whose children were bound by promise. They preserved these details not in writing but in story, song, and counsel. To forget was to invite disaster, to remember was to rule. Marriage, in this world, was not romance but alliance. Every union was a political act, a negotiation of wealth, property, and protection. A father might offer his daughter to seal peace between rival clans, but the woman's consent still mattered. The sagas tell of brides who refused offers, who demanded better terms or a man of equal worth. If she married, she brought a dowry but also power. Her husband gained land, wealth, and sometimes legitimacy through her lineage. In return, she expected respect, and authority within the household. Once married, a woman became mistress of her Hola Husfreyja. Her keys symbolized not only domestic control but legal ownership. The stores of food, the treasures locked in chests, the management of servants all fell under her authority. She represented her husband in trade, in disputes, in law. If he died, she could continue his affairs, sell property, and manage the estate. In Iceland, widows often became landowners and power brokers in their own right, navigating the thin assembly of free men through male proxies or sons. The sagas brim with examples of women who shaped history through cunning rather than conquest. And the deep-minded, one of the most remarkable figures in early Icelandic settlement, fled Scotland after her son's death, built a ship in secret, and led her family across the sea. She claimed land in her own name, distributed estates to her kin, and founded dynasties that endured for generations. Her saga describes her as a woman of great wisdom and foresight. When she died, she was buried in a ship, a mark of respect usually reserved for chieftains. Then there was Gudruna's the first daughter, the central figure of Laxdæla's saga, whose life reads like a tapestry of love, loss, and vengeance. Married 4 times, she was both victim and architect of her destiny. Her beauty and intelligence made her the axis around which the lives of men turned. When her husband was slain by her lover, she demanded vengeance from her sons, saying, "Now my heart is glad, for I have seen my husband's cloak red with the blood of his killer." Her story is both tragedy and triumph, showing how a woman, denied the sword, could still shape fate through words sharper than steel. Even in daily life, a Viking woman's influence radiated beyond her home. Feasts, for instance, were not just celebrations, they were stages of diplomacy. The Husfreyja presided over them with the same precision as a general before battle. She directed the seating, which symbolized rank. She ensured the mead horn passed in the correct order, that no insult went unanswered, that alliances were affirmed through gift and gesture. A misplaced cup, a wrong word, could ignite blood feud. Her calm command was the invisible force that kept peace or let chaos loose. The Norse world was one of ceaseless negotiation between kin, clans, gods, and seasons. In this endless flux, women were the constant. They embodied continuity. Their task was not only to birth children but to sustain the web of connection that kept a community whole. The sagas portray them as mediators and avengers alike, the keepers of justice when the law faltered. Sometimes, that justice was brutal. Blood called for blood, and a woman's tongue could wield that law like a blade. In Njol's saga, Haggard Longlegs goads her husband into acts of vengeance that spiral into tragedy. When asked if she would forgive a slap given years before, she replies coldly, "I will remember it." Her memory becomes weapon and curse alike. The sagas never portray such women as purely wicked. They are fierce embodiments of a world where forgetting was weakness. But women were also peacemakers. Wise matrons often ended feuds through careful marriage arrangements or the exchange of gifts. They spoke at the right moment, tempered anger with reason, reminded men of their honor when rage threatened to devour it. Their speech carried authority not because it was loud but because it was true. This balance of vengeance and mercy defined the moral world of the Vikings. A woman's greatness was measured not only by her courage, but by her hugi, her mind, her soul force. She was expected to be strong but also shrewd. In a society that valued boldness, she was both anchor and compass. Childbirth, too, was an act of cosmic bravery. Every birth was a gamble with death, and yet women faced it again and again without complaint. In that blood and pain lay the most profound act of creation, a power even the gods revered. It was said that women who died in childbirth went to Fokvanger, Freyja's field, the same realm where fallen warriors found rest. Thus, the Norse saw no divide between the courage of battle and the courage of life. Both were sacred, and through it all, the feasts, the births, the funerals, the Viking woman's work was never done. She tended the fires that never slept, both literal and spiritual. When the storms raged, she kept her hull steady. When famine threatened, she rationed and prayed. When war came, she buried the dead and carried on. Her endurance was the quiet foundation upon which every saga stood. Fearlessness for her was not a single moment of defiance, but a lifelong devotion to balance, to holding the fragile web together even when it trembled. She did not need to stand on the prow of a dragon ship or wield a sword to prove her worth. Her courage was in the thousand unseen choices that turned chaos into continuity. The poets sang of Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory flying across the world each day to bring him news. But they could just as easily have been the spirits of Viking women, carrying the weight of remembrance, shaping fate through wisdom and will. When you picture the north in your mind, the fjords, the longships, the clang of iron, remember that behind every saga hero stood a woman who forged his destiny. She may not have worn armor, but she bore the heaviest burden, the keeping of names, the tending of flame, the unbroken continuity of life against the cold. The sagas end in blood, as all stories do, but the legacy of Viking women endures in quieter ways. In the steadiness of those who work without praise, in the patience of those who build while others destroy, in the strength of those who remember. They were not fearless because they lacked fear. They were fearless because they carried it, wove it, and made it part of the world's endurance. They ruled not with swords but with memory, and in that memory, their empire still lives. In the glittering haze of modern myth, the image of the shield maiden looms large, a fierce woman, blade in hand, her hair whipping in the northern wind, standing shoulder to shoulder with men on the field of battle. She is the emblem of defiance, the embodiment of freedom, the roar of independence in a world of iron and fire. But how real was she? Did Viking women truly fight as warriors? Or is this image a saga-born dream, a reflection of something more symbolic than literal? To answer this, we must first peel away the centuries of legend that have grown around the word shield maiden. The Old Norse term skjaldmr appears in only a few sagas, and each time, it blurs the line between myth and history. The Volsunga saga tells of Brynhildr, a Valkyria punished by Odin and condemned to live as a mortal woman. The Hervarar saga gives us Hervar, who dresses as a man, takes up arms, and fights for the cursed sword Turfing. And in the saga of the Jomsvikings, we hear of women who trained alongside their male kin, testing their mettle in the art of war. Yet, for all their presence in story, archaeology has long been silent, or at least, it was until recently. In 2017, a discovery in Birka, Sweden, changed the conversation forever. There, in a grave known for over a century as that of a high-ranking male warrior, genetic analysis revealed a stunning truth. The bones were female. Buried with her were 2 horses, a full arsenal of weapons, and a gaming board, a sign of tactical knowledge and command. The warrior of Birka was no legend. She was real. This revelation sent shockwaves through the scholarly world. For years, historians had assumed that Viking warfare was a male domain, that the few stories of fighting women were poetic exaggerations or moral allegories. But the Birka grave forced a reckoning. If one such woman existed, how many others had been overlooked, mislabeled, or quietly erased by centuries of assumption? Still, caution is needed. One grave does not rewrite an entire society. The Viking world was complex, pragmatic, and deeply stratified. Not every woman had the freedom or reason to take up arms. But perhaps the shield maiden was not meant to be a statistical norm. Perhaps she was an archetype, the living edge of possibility in a culture that both revered and feared female power. In the Norse imagination, strength was not limited by gender. The gods themselves blurred boundaries. Odin, the All-Father, practiced Sidra form of magic considered feminine, taught to him by Freya. Thor, the thunder god, once donned a bridal dress to reclaim his stolen hammer. Power, in this mythic world, was fluid. To act decisively, to wield force, these were divine acts, accessible to any who dared. So, when a saga spoke of a woman who fought, it was not merely an anomaly. It was an expression of cosmic balance, a reminder that fate word could twist, that the threads of destiny were not bound by man's law. Archaeology, too, offers hints of this ambiguity. Beyond Burqa, other graves have revealed weapons buried alongside women, spears, axes, shields. In some cases, these may have been symbolic, tokens of honor or family status. In others, perhaps evidence of real warriors. A mass grave in England containing fallen Norse raiders shows that some of the skeletons were female, their wounds identical to those of men. Were they warriors or camp followers caught in slaughter? The line remains blurred, but the possibility is alive. To the Vikings, what mattered most was agency, the ability to act with intent. A woman who took up arms in defense of her kin was not condemned but respected. The sagas praise women who show courage, whether through sword, word, or well. Consider the tale of Laudgertha, the most famous shield maiden of them all. The medieval chronicler Saxo Grammaticus wrote of her as a companion to Ragnar Lothbrok, who met her when she fought to free women from a tyrant. Impressed by her bravery, Ragnar sought her hand, but she tested him first, releasing a bear and a hound against him when he came to woo her. Ragnar slew them both, and she became his wife. Later, when he faced rebellion, she rode into battle once more, her hair unbound, her spear flashing, rallying his troops to victory. Saxo calls her matchless among women. Modern historians doubt Saxo's literal accuracy. He wrote centuries after the Viking Age, through the lens of Christian Europe, where warrior women were exotic, even scandalous. Yet his description captures something essential, that in the collective memory of the North, courage was not gendered. And perhaps this is the truest core of the shield maiden myth. Not that thousands of women fought in the shield wall, but that they could have, and that this possibility reflected a society both more flexible and more pragmatic than later medieval Europe would allow. In Norse poetry, women were often compared to weapons, sharp, bright, unyielding. Bekennings, those poetic metaphors beloved by skalds, spoke of battle maidens and spear goddesses. Some referred to actual fighters, others to the Valkyries, the divine choosers of the slain. The Valkyria was more than a fantasy of warlike beauty. She was a cosmic functionary, deciding who lived, who died, who ascended to Valhalla. She embodied both life and death, nurturing and annihilating in equal measure. It is no coincidence that mortal women who showed exceptional courage were sometimes described as Valkyria-like. The boundary between myth and life was thin. To act like a goddess was not blasphemy, it was aspiration. But what did this mean in everyday terms? The shield maiden, if she existed, was not always a raider or commander. She might be a farmer's daughter defending her homestead, a widow leading her men after her husband's fall, or a settler fending off invaders on a new frontier. Violence, after all, was never far away in the Viking world. A woman who knew how to wield a blade could mean the difference between life and annihilation. Training for combat was not unthinkable. Children, both boys and girls, learned to use tools, herd animals, and fight off threats. Strength and resilience were necessary for survival. While men specialized in raiding, women mastered endurance, physical, emotional, spiritual, and in moments of crisis, endurance became action. Some sagas even suggest organized female militias. The Saxo recounts how, during the legendary battles of the Danes, women trained themselves for war, disdaining the duties of the loom. He lists entire companies of them, Rusla, Stikla, Hetha, who fought beside men. Whether these tales were exaggerated or not, they reveal that the Norse imagination never fully excluded women from battle. The Christian chroniclers, however, were less kind. To them, a woman who fought was unnatural, a disruption of divine order. Yet their horror only underscores how different the Norse worldview was. The Vikings saw balance in duality, fire and ice, life and death, man and woman. Each contained the other's potential. Thus, when a woman stood on the battlefield, she was not betraying her nature, she was fulfilling it. To protect one's kin, to avenge injustice, to assert will, These were the duties of every human being. Even so, not all acts of female defiance required swords. In many ways, the verbal duels, the fighting, were battles of equal ferocity. In these contests of wit and insult, women could humiliate warriors, strip them of honor with a single phrase. Their words, sharp as steel, could undo what armies had built. The sagas tell of women who mocked their husbands for cowardice until they rose to vengeance, others who used cunning to turn enemies against each other. A well-placed word could kill faster than an axe. In such moments, the line between shield maiden and wise woman vanished. Both were masters of survival in a world that respected strength above all else. The shield maiden, then, is more than a relic of folklore. She is a symbol of possibility, of the many ways women could inhabit courage in a brutal age. Her existence, whether rare or widespread, testifies to the Viking belief that fate honors boldness, no matter who wields it. When we look upon her now in art, in story, in our collective imagination, we are not merely seeing a warrior. We are seeing a mirror, reflecting the ancient truth that fearlessness is not bound by body or title. It is an inheritance of the spirit passed down from those who dared to live on the edge of the world and still called it home. Her shield may be buried under centuries of soil, her name forgotten, but her echo endures in every act of quiet defiance, every stand made in the face of the impossible. The shield maiden was real, if not always of flesh and bone. She was, and remains, the heart of the Viking soul, resolute, unbroken, and eternally free. If the shield maiden embodied the storm, the woman of the hearth embodied the earth itself, quiet, steadfast, and essential. The saga age, for all its tales of blood and conquest, was not sustained by warriors alone. Behind every voyage, every trade route, every hall raised from timber and toil, stood women whose labor wove the very fabric of Viking life. They were the guardians of the homestead, the arbiters of survival, and the unseen axis around which the turning world revolved. In the longhouse, her domain was sacred. The hearth, that glowing heart of flame, was not just a place of warmth. It was the spiritual center of the home. From its light came food, comfort, and ceremony. It was where oaths were sworn, where the newborn first saw light, and where the dying took their final breath. To keep that fire alive was to hold the family's spirit in one's hands. The woman of the house, the husfreyja, was its keeper, a title that meant far more than housewife. The husfreyja held authority both practical and moral. Her keys hung at her belt, a visible sign of her control over the household stores and wealth. Those keys to chests of silver, to granaries, to cupboards of linen and ale symbolized stewardship and respect. A husband might rule abroad, but in his absence, the home was hers entirely. Should he die, his wife became widow and heir, inheriting his lands and debts, negotiating alliances, even commissioning ships or marriages. She was no passive figure awaiting rescue. She was the continuity of the clan. In Iceland's sagas, this authority often takes striking form. Consider Odd the Deep-Minded, one of the great matriarchs of early settlement. Widowed after her husband's death abroad, she built her own ship, a colossal feat, and sailed from the Orkneys to Iceland with kin and thralls, carving out her own territory upon arrival. She distributed land, established a homestead, and ruled as a chieftain in her own right. Even after her death, her descendants honored her as deep-minded indeed, wise in counsel, shrewd in leadership, and unyielding in spirit. Stories like hers reveal the quiet power that posed beneath the surface of Norse society. It was a world that demanded strength, but not always the strength of arms. Resilience, adaptability, intelligence, these were virtues as valued in a woman as valor in a man. Within the household, women orchestrated an intricate economy. They managed farming, weaving, brewing, dairy work, and trade. The spinning wheel and loom were as critical as the sword or plow. Every thread of cloth woven for sails, every tunic stitched for trade, every skin tanned for barter represented hours of female labor. To create was to conquer time, to tame chaos into order, to transform the raw into the useful. Even language bears witness to this power. The Old Norse word fru, meaning lady, shares roots with Freyr, lord, and Freya, the goddess of fertility, wealth, and magic. A fru was not defined by subservience, but by stewardship, by her ability to nurture both life and prosperity. Religious duties, too, often fell to women. Before Christianity reshaped Scandinavia, it was women who tended the household gods, who offered sacrifices to Freyr and Thor, who whispered blessings over fields and infants alike. The Disir ancestral spirits believed to protect families were thought to favor the voices of women. During the Disabla, an annual feast of the ancestors, the matron of the house might lead prayers, invoking the strength of those who came before. This spiritual guardianship was deeply interwoven with emotional wisdom. The sagas speak often of women as keepers of memory, the ones who recited genealogies, who remembered debts and grudges, who preserved the stories that bound kin together. A husband might die on the sea, a son in battle, but the woman who remained carried their names forward. In her remembrance, they were immortal. And yet, this role came with its own brand of fearlessness. For to keep peace within a clan was as perilous as battle itself. The sagas brim with scenes of women standing between vengeance and ruin, urging restraint, or else demanding blood. In Jo's saga, Bergthora defends her household with unflinching pride, refusing to abandon her husband even when flames consume their hall. In Laxdæla saga, Guðrún, the first daughter, moves through her life as both victim and author of tragedy, her cunning shaping the destinies of men who underestimate her. Their power was not overt, but it was decisive. A whispered word could steer alliances. A withheld blessing could break them. The hearth was a battlefield of settler wars, those fought with loyalty, patience, and memory. Daily life itself demanded courage. Winters in the north were long and merciless. The Husfreyja was responsible for storing enough food to last until spring, for preserving meat and grain, for keeping children and livestock alive through frost and famine. Firewood had to be gathered, milk churned, flax spun, clothes mended, wounds treated. Every task was an act of resistance against nature's indifference. To wake each day and work, despite grief or exhaustion, was its own form of heroism. A hero's death might earn a saga, but the heroism of endurance sustained the world unseen. When Christianity arrived, it did not erase this domestic authority, but it changed its tone. The new faith idealized humility and obedience, virtues that clashed with the older Norse esteem for will and self-reliance. The figure of the Virgin Mary replaced Freya, submission supplanted strength. Yet even within the new order, women continued to wield influence as patrons of churches, keepers of relics, and preservers of custom. They adapted, as they always had. The transformation of faith was, in many ways, another kind of weaving old gods and new myth and memory, all bound together by the same hands that spun wool and fate alike. It is easy to romanticize the Viking woman as either warrior or witch, but to understand her fully, one must also see her as worker, as the foundation upon which everything else rested. Without her, there was no voyage, no feast, no lineage. Her life was not written in the bold strokes of conquest, but in the quiet persistence of creation. And yet, in that quiet, there was immense strength. When men sailed for distant shores, they did so knowing that home endured behind them, that fires still burned, that children still laughed, that the cycle of birth and harvest continued. The woman of the hearth made that endurance possible. She was the anchor in an age of storms. Her courage was not sung by skalds, but it was felt in every breath of her world. In the warmth of the hall, the steady beat of the loom, the echo of her voice calling her kin to table. She did not need a shield or a spear to shape destiny. Her tools were simpler, but no less powerful: fire, thread, memory, and will. And so, while the sagas praised the shield maiden for facing death without fear, they also, more quietly, Honor the woman who faced life with the same unyielding spirit, the one who kept her fire alive through the dark months, who built her family's legacy not in blood, but in the daily acts of courage that made survival possible. In her endurance lies the truest reflection of Viking fearlessness, not the loud, sudden blaze of battle, but the steady, enduring flame that never, ever went out. The Viking world was never bounded by the icy fjords and pine-dark forests of Scandinavia. It stretched outward like a great tide, following rivers and sea routes that reached from the green shores of Ireland to the golden domes of Byzantium. And as those longships cut through wind and wave, it was not only men who journeyed. Women, too, traveled the world, merchants, settlers, wives, and sometimes rulers, carrying with them the voice of the North and the quiet authority of their hearths. To imagine them, you must picture more than warriors. Picture a woman standing on the deck of a ship, cloak whipping in the salt wind, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The voyage was dangerous, storms, raged, disease, yet she went willingly, because her world demanded motion. Where men sought silver, women sought continuity, the chance to build homes, to plant seed and kin in foreign soil. When the Vikings settled in Iceland, the Faroes, Greenland, and later Vinland, women went with them. The Icelandic Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, lists not only men but women among the founders. Some were free, others thralls, yet each played a role in shaping a new world out of wilderness. They carried cattle and children, seeds and songs, and the memory of old customs into unbroken land. In Greenland, their presence was crucial. There, amid ice and silence, it was the women who sustained life through skill and adaptation. They learned to sew sealskin, to hunt with snares, to trade with the Inuit for furs and ivory. Archaeological finds show weaving weights and spindle whorls beside weapons, proof that craft and combat coexisted in that fragile colony. Without their labor, Eric the Red settlement would have frozen into myth before a single generation passed. And then there was Vinland, the fleeting Norse foothold in North America. Among the few named women to cross that final frontier was Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, whose story glows like a spark in the sagas. She was born in Iceland, sailed to Greenland, then to Vinland with her husband, where she gave birth to a son, the first known child of European descent born on that continent. Her life did not end in exile. She later made a pilgrimage to Rome, walking across half the known world, speaking with popes and kings before returning home to Iceland, where she ended her days as a nun. Her story is more than adventure. It is a testament to endurance and curiosity, a life that spanned oceans and faiths. She was not unique in her mobility. Viking women appear in records from Russia to the Mediterranean, sometimes as traders, sometimes as wives in mixed households, sometimes as slaves whose resilience transformed captivity into influence. In the east, the river routes of the Varangians carried them deep into the Slavic lands. In Kiev and Novgorod, Norse women married local nobles, weaving alliances that birthed new dynasties. Archaeological finds in these regions, brooches of Scandinavian-style, runic inscriptions, Norse grave goods, tell of their presence. They became mediators between cultures, bringing northern customs into foreign courts. Further south, the sagas and chronicles whisper of women who reached even Constantinople. The Byzantine Greeks called the Norse Varangians. Their men served as mercenaries in the emperor's elite guard. Yet the women who accompanied them were no less remarkable. Some traded furs and amber for silk and spices. Others settled, marrying into Byzantine families. One Greek account describes a northern woman's funeral on the banks of the Dnieper, conducted with the same solemn fire rituals practiced in Scandinavia, proof that even far from home, they carried their faith in flame and fate. Commerce was the artery of Viking life, and women were part of its pulse. Markets across the north, in Hedeby, Burka, bustled with female merchants selling cloth, jewelry, and imported wares. Silver from the east, glass beads from the south, walrus ivory from the Arctic, all passed through their hands. In a society where wealth equaled freedom, Their trading skill was both economic and symbolic power. Some even controlled workshops, producing textiles so fine that kings sought them as tribute. The spinning wheel was more than domestic labor. It was commerce. Ships might bring treasure home, but it was women's weaving that clothed the voyagers, filled the markets, and bound communities through exchange. But trade and travel were not the only paths to power. Some women ruled kingdoms, and ruled them well. Take Queen Asa, Harald's daughter of Egder, mother of Harald Fairhair, the first king to unite Norway. Widowed young, she ruled her realm alone, defending her son's inheritance against rival chieftains until he came of age. Her political cunning and ferocity in vengeance became legend, setting the stage for the rise of a dynasty. Or consider Queen Gunhild, wife of Eric Bloodaxe, remembered as the mother of kings. Chronicles call her ambitious, ruthless, a sorceress who whispered to spirits and bent men's wills, but beneath those slanders lies respect. She was the power behind the throne, negotiating alliances, commanding loyalty, and ensuring that her sons held crowns across Scandinavia and beyond. In Denmark, Queen Thyra, wife of Gorm the Old, was revered as the pride of Denmark. The gelling stones, carved by her son Harald Bluetooth, immortalize her as the woman who saved Denmark, likely through diplomacy, foresight, and the strengthening of fortifications against invasion. Even centuries later, her name stood for wisdom and unity. These women were not anomalies. They were the apex of a spectrum of female agency that ran through every layer of Norse society. From thrall to queen, Viking women shaped the fate of families and kingdoms alike. Their power might shift with circumstance, but it never vanished. And when Christianity spread across the north, they once again adapted. Noble women became patrons of churches and monasteries, using faith as a new stage for influence. They commissioned stone crosses bearing their names, blending pagan imagery with Christian hope. In their prayers, one can still hear echoes of the old invocations, not just to God but to destiny, to the unseen powers that had always listened. To travel in those days, to trade, to rule, all required courage. But perhaps the truest courage lay in what united them all, a refusal to remain still. The Viking woman, whether merchant or monarch, moved through the world with purpose. She was a bearer of culture, a maker of bridges, a weaver of both cloth and fate. And though later centuries would confine her image to hearth and cradle, her legacy runs deeper, beneath the surface of history, steady as the tides her ancestors once sailed. She stands as the living proof that fearlessness is not a single act of defiance but a lifelong voyage, one that crosses seas, faiths, and centuries, and still does not end. Her footsteps echo through the ports of the Baltic, the markets of Novgorod, the palaces of Byzantium, the ruins of Greenland. Wherever the North touched the world, she was there, silent, steady, indomitable. And if you listen closely, when the wind sweeps over the fjords or whispers across a field of standing stones, you can almost hear her voice, not a shout of conquest, but a song of endurance, the song of a woman who knew no borders, only horizons. The Vikings lived by the sea and the sword, but above both loomed something greater, fate, the unseen hand that wove every life into the vast tapestry of existence. They called it word or erg, meaning what is laid down. In this world, every birth and death, every triumph and tragedy, was part of a pattern spun by powers older than the gods themselves. And at the center of that pattern stood women, not just mortal women, but the divine weavers of destiny, the Norns. To understand the Viking woman's fearlessness, you must understand her relationship to fate. For to live under the watch of the Norns was to know that death could not be avoided, only met with dignity. It was to believe that every moment, even the smallest, carried weight in the cosmic design, and that courage was not about changing fate, but about walking into it unflinching. The Norns, Erd, Verdandi, and Skuld dwelled beneath Yggdrasil, the world tree, where they wove the threads of all lives from their well of memory. Erd, the past; Verdandi, the present; Skuld, the future. Even Odin, the All-Father, was subject to their weaving. When Viking women spun wool or flax, when they wove cloth at their looms, they echoed the motions of the Norns. Each thread was symbolic of life, a choice, a destiny. The loom was an altar, the act of weaving a quiet, daily form of magic. This link between women and fate was not metaphorical. It was spiritual. A woman's ability to bring life into the world made her a vessel of creation, and thus of destiny itself. The sagas often show women speaking prophecy, interpreting dreams, or foreseeing death, not as mystics apart, but as natural extensions of their awareness. They knew that life was fragile, that every winter might be the last, and from that knowledge came calm, not despair. To the Viking mind, death was not an ending but a passage. Men dreamed of Valhalla, where fallen warriors feasted with Odin until Ragnarok. But there were other realms, Folkvanger, Freya's field, where half of the slain were said to go Helheim, the quiet world of the dead, ruled by Hel, daughter of Loki. Freya and Hel, both women, presided over what came after life. Death, like birth, belonged to the feminine. Perhaps that is why Viking women did not fear it as something alien. They tended the dying, prepared the bodies, led the laments. Archaeologists have uncovered graves where women's burials are rich with symbolic care, jewels, tools, food, animals, all meant to accompany them into the next world. In some, small knives and shears lie beside the bones, as if the woman might continue cutting the threads of fate even beyond death. These rituals were acts of love and defiance. The funeral pyre, blazing against the northern night, was both farewell and promise, the declaration that the fire of one life could illuminate the darkness for others. The women who kindled those flames knew that their own time would come, and they did not shrink from it. They prepared for it as they prepared for every journey, with steadiness and grace. In the sagas, this acceptance of fate often gives women a power that terrifies men. When a seeress or matron speaks of death, her words cannot be dismissed. It will be as she says. The warriors murmur, not because they are superstitious, but because they recognize that her sight pierces deeper than their swords ever could. She sees the pattern beneath the battle. Consider the tale of the Daraharojos, the song of the Valkyries. In this ancient poem, a man glimpses 12 women weaving a tapestry of war with human entrails for thread, arrows for weft, and swords for beaters. They chant the fates of men as they weave, naming who will fall and who will stand. When they finish, they tear the cloth in half to Odin, half to the earth. It is gruesome and beautiful at once, an image of creation and destruction as one act. The Viking woman's fearlessness drew from this understanding that life itself was woven from both light and shadow, and that no one, not even the gods, could escape the pattern. Yet within that inevitability, there was freedom. The freedom to meet one's fate with honor. Even motherhood, often seen as the gentlest of roles, carried its own form of bravery. To bring a child into such a harsh world was an act of defiance against chaos. Infant mortality was high, childbirth dangerous, and yet they bore children, not in ignorance, but in defiance of fear. In sagas, a woman's endurance in childbirth is spoken of with the same reverence as a man's valor in battle. Both risked their lives for the continuation of the clan. When a husband fell in war or a son did not return from sea, the women who remained did not collapse. They grieved, yes, but they also acted. They avenged, rebuilt, remarried if they must. The wheel of life turned, and they turned with it. Fearlessness, for them, was not in grand gestures, but in the constancy of their will. The raven, sacred to Odin, was the symbol of both wisdom and death. It flew over battlefields, feasting on the fallen, carrying their souls to the gods. But in the old songs, the raven also symbolized memory, the eternal witness. Women were often compared to ravens, both for their dark insight and for their role as keepers of remembrance. The raven watched, and so did they. To live as a Viking woman was to exist in conversation with the inevitable, to see life as a cycle of creation, destruction, and renewal. Every thread woven, every story told, every tear shed was part of that rhythm. And in embracing it fully, they achieved a kind of peace that modern minds can scarcely grasp. It is this peace, this acceptance without submission, that made them truly fearless. Not the loud courage of conquest, but the quiet strength of understanding. They did not fight against death. They lived so that when it came, they would meet it standing, eyes open, hearts steady, as all their foremothers had before them. Even now, their legacy lingers. In the modern North, woven patterns and runic carvings still echo the old belief that fate and courage are bound. The image of the Norns endures in art and story. The loom remains a symbol not only of domesticity, but of destiny, of the eternal weaving that joins past, present, and future. And perhaps that is the truest measure of the Viking woman's fearlessness, that her understanding of life was vast enough to hold both love and loss, creation and death, and to call them all by the same name, necessity. She knew that every thread, even the darkest, had its place in the pattern. She did not flinch before it. She simply kept weaving, her hands steady as the world turned, her gaze clear as the northern stars. In her silence, there was truth. In her endurance, eternity. In her fearlessness, the heartbeat of an age that has never truly ended. The Viking Age did not end with the clang of swords or the burning of longships. It ended in silence, in prayer, in the slow turning of hearts from the old gods to the new. When the cross came north, it came not only to kings and warriors but to women. And it was the women who often stood at the crossroads of that transformation, torn between two worlds, the ancient faith of their foremothers and the encroaching promise of salvation from the south. In the sagas and in archaeology alike, you can trace this transformation not through the ruins of churches but through graves. Once, the dead were buried with amulets of Thor's hammer, runic charms, and offerings of mead and bread. Then, gradually, the symbols changed. Crosses of silver began to appear beside hammers of iron, as if the women who wore them sought protection from both gods at once. In that blending half-pagan, half-Christian there lies the story of a civilization in transition, and of women who carried that tension in their very blood. For centuries, the Viking woman's spiritual power had been unquestioned. The Vaelva, the seeress, was a figure of reverence and fear. Cloaked in blue, her staff carved with symbols, she walked among chieftains as an equal, sometimes as a prophet, sometimes as a judge. Her voice carried the weight of fate itself. In the saga of Eric the Red, a Vaelva named Horbjörg is invited to a feast during a time of famine. She eats, sings, and speaks the future with calm precision. Her words shape the hopes of an entire settlement. Such women were bridges between the mortal and the divine. But when Christianity spread across the north, such bridges were condemned as paths of darkness. The new faith saw the old rituals seething magic, runes, the calling of spirits as witchcraft. The Vaelvas, once honored, became hunted. The female connection to mystery, which had once been a source of dignity, now marked them for suspicion. The transformation was not immediate. For generations, the old and new beliefs coexisted in an easy harmony. A woman might attend Mass in the morning and whisper an old charm over her children at night. The hearth remained sacred, as it always had been. Bread was baked for Christ, but the first slice might still be set aside for the household spirits, the Landvertier. This dual faith created a strange kind of resilience. The Viking woman's fearlessness took on a new form, not the defiance of battle, but the quiet courage to live between worlds. She became both pagan and Christian, both keeper of tradition and mother of the future. She carried two truths at once, and found no contradiction in them. There are stories half history, half warning of women accused of the old magic. Even after baptism, the church feared what it could not understand. The woman who still spoke with the dead, who still read the wind, who knew which herbs healed, and which cursed. These were not witches, as the later Middle Ages would imagine them, cackling in shadow, but remnants of an older power, women who refused to surrender their birthright. In Norway and Iceland, laws began to forbid the practice of sire. The punishment was exile or death. Yet, even as the edicts were read in churches, the old songs persisted in secret. Mothers whispered runes into their children's ears for protection before sleep. Midwives still muttered invocations to Freya as they eased a child into the world. In the countryside, far from bishops and kings, faith was a tapestry, not a boundary. And sometimes the two faiths intertwined beautifully. Freya, goddess of love and death, began to mirror the Virgin Mary, who also wept for her lost son. Frigg, Odin's wise wife, shared qualities with Saint Bridget and other holy women who guarded the hearth. Even the Valkyries, those choosers of the slain, seemed not unlike angels in their divine purpose. Conversion, in truth, was not a replacement, it was a translation. The Viking woman, ever practical, saw no need to discard what worked. If Christ offered comfort in suffering, she prayed. If the old charms kept her family safe, she used them. To her, truth was not confined to doctrine, it lived in action. But there were moments of real conflict too. Some women refused baptism outright. Others were baptized under pressure, their acceptance of the new faith a political necessity rather than conviction. The sagas tell of queens and noble women who resisted conversion fiercely, seeing it as a betrayal of their ancestors. In these stories, the cross was not just a symbol of hope, it was also a weapon of erasure, a threat to the stories they held sacred. Take, for instance, Queen Gunhild, remembered as both witch and ruler. To some, she was a sorceress who controlled kings and cursed her enemies. To others, she was a woman of intelligence and power, vilified for daring to wield influence in a man's world. As Christianity took hold, such women became moral warnings, embodiments of what the new faith sought to purge. Yet, their legends survived, because the North remembered what it could not quite condemn: the awe of female will. The coming of Christianity changed not only religion but the very texture of fearlessness. In the old world, courage meant facing death without trembling. In the new, it meant faith enduring life's trials with patience, turning suffering into sacrifice. For Viking women, this was a different kind of heroism, no less fierce, but more inward. They learned to find strength in humility, to bear hardship as Christ bore the cross. And still, under the hymns and the candles, the old courage paused. When famine struck, when winter froze the earth, it was not theology that kept families alive, it was the same unbreakable will that had always guided them. The same hands that once wove the threads of fate now folded in prayer, but the spirit behind the gesture remained the same. The church would later call the old belief superstition, but perhaps superstition was just memory of a world where women spoke with gods and fate listened. Even as centuries passed, traces of that defiant spirituality survived in folklore. In the dark of winter, people still left offerings for the Nis, the household spirit. At midsummer, girls still cast flowers into the water to read their future lovers. The line between saint and spirit blurred until even the priests could not always tell them apart. Fearlessness had not died, it had adapted. The Viking woman no longer stood on the battlefield, nor sang the spells of the Vaelva. Instead, she survived through the centuries, her strength hidden beneath the surface of faith, her fire disguised as devotion. In the dim light of the northern churches, where candles flickered beside carved dragons on ancient beams, one could still feel it, the heartbeat of the Old North, slow and steady, refusing to fade. And perhaps that is the truest power of these women, not that they conquered, but that they endured, not that they defied gods, but that they carried them forward, reshaped and remembered. Into every new dawn that followed, they were fearless because they refused to forget who they had been, even when the world changed around them. And though the sagas called them wives, queens, or witches, what they really were was eternal. The soul of the North, unbroken, unafraid, and still whispering through the long winter nights. The power of the Viking woman was not measured only in her courage, her skill with weapons, or her mastery of the hearth. It was also measured in her ability to shape the lives of others through kinship, marriage, and lineage. In the North, blood was both literal and symbolic, the lifeblood that carried inheritance, honor, and obligation. And it was women who often held the loom on which these bonds were woven. In Norse society, family was everything. The clan or it defined status, obligation, and identity. A man might win fame on the battlefield, but a woman ensured that his name, deeds, and bloodline endured. She kept track of genealogies, remembering every cousin, in-law, and ancestor whose life had contributed to the family's standing. This knowledge was power. To misplace it was to invite chaos. To wield it with skill was to rule quietly, yet decisively. Marriage, in particular, was a political instrument. It was rarely purely a matter of affection. It was a contractive alliance, a tool of diplomacy. Women who married strategically could influence the balance of power between clans or kingdoms. They could bring wealth, land, or legitimacy to their husband's house, and in return they often negotiated rights for themselves and their children. A wise bride could secure autonomy, property, and influence in ways that many male warriors could not. The sagas are filled with examples of such women. Consider Halgerd Longlegs, whose marriages and schemes shaped the outcomes of multiple feuds, or Odd the Deep-Minded, who used her travels and marriages to consolidate power and settle her family in Iceland, ensuring her descendants would hold land and influence for generations. These women were architects of destiny in ways subtle, strategic, and enduring. Beyond marriage, Viking women exercised power within the household. They were often the executors of property and inheritance, managing estates during their husbands' absences or after their death. Widows, in particular, could wield significant influence. In Iceland, some widows controlled land, managed thralls, and even represented their families in the Thing, the assembly of free men. Their authority was recognized and respected, a testament to the pragmatism of Norse society. This power extended to children. Viking women were primary educators, teaching not only domestic skills but also values, customs, and social norms. They told stories of gods, heroes, and ancestors, instilling a sense of identity and duty in the next generation. Through narrative, they preserved history, law, and morality. They could inspire courage, caution, or cunning, guiding future warriors, chieftains, and rulers long before they ever touched a sword. The ability to remember and manipulate these bonds gave women political leverage. Feuds were often settled or escalated through negotiation orchestrated by female family members. A woman's intervention could prevent slaughter or, alternatively, ensure it by demanding vengeance on behalf of kin. In this way, the most feared power of a Viking woman was not physical strength, but her control over obligation, honor, and memory. In royal circles, this influence expanded even further. Queens and noble women shaped foreign alliances through marriage, diplomacy, and counsel. They advised kings, guided heirs, and sometimes ruled in their own right. Women such as Thyra of Denmark, mother of Harald Bluetooth, ensured dynastic stability through political acumen and foresight, earning respect in both life and legend. Even beyond Scandinavia, Viking women could impact the political landscape. In the eastern trade routes and settlements, they married into foreign families, acting as cultural and political intermediaries. Their presence could cement alliances, ease tensions, and introduce Norse customs into distant lands. Through these networks, Viking women wielded influence that was invisible but potent, shaping the flow of trade power and diplomacy across continents. Yet, with this power came responsibility. A woman's failure could bring ruin, a mismanaged marriage, an insult ignored, or a debt left unsettled could spark feuds, wars, or loss of status. The sagas frequently recount the consequences of failed diplomacy, and vengeance left unchecked. Women's decisions carried weight because they affected not only their families, but the wider social fabric. The concept of honor, central to Norse culture, applied equally to women. They were expected to act with courage, integrity, and intelligence. They were responsible for defending family honor, for mediating disputes, and for ensuring that future generations upheld the values of their lineage. Their fearlessness was expressed not always in battle, but in their moral courage, in the strength to act wisely under pressure. It is worth noting that the combination of domestic, economic, spiritual, and political authority made Viking women remarkably versatile. They were farmers, traders, healers, advisors, and rulers. They navigated a society structured around male combat and warfare, yet found ways to exercise autonomy and influence that could rival that of men. Their power was often invisible to outsiders, but it was essential to the survival and prosperity of their families, communities, and even nations. The sagas, though sometimes dramatized, consistently recognized the central role of women in shaping fate. They remembered not only the men who died on the battlefield, but also the women who ensured that life continued, that the hearth burned, that children grew into leaders, and that the honor of families and clans remained intact. Ultimately, the Viking woman's greatest strength lay in her understanding of interconnectedness, of kin, community, and legacy. She was a master of networks, a strategist of bloodlines, and a weaver of futures. Through her, history was not only lived but guided, and the decisions she made could echo through generations. Her fearlessness was therefore multifaceted. It was the courage to act in the household and society, and in diplomacy, the courage to preserve and defend honor, and the courage to shape destiny without ever holding a sword. In the tapestry of Viking life, women were not mere threads. They were the loom itself, holding together the fabric of the North, steady against the storms of fate. The legacy of these women, their wisdom, resilience, and strategic acumen, survives in the sagas, in archaeology, and in the cultural memory of the North. They remind us that courage is not always a flash of steel, but often a lifetime of decisions, actions, and influence, all quietly, relentlessly guiding the future. While many Viking women wielded influence through hearth and kinship, some crossed into the domain of battle itself, becoming more than myth. The sagas recount their deeds in ways that blur the line between legend and reality, and archaeology increasingly supports the idea that women were sometimes active participants in conflict. These women, though rare, challenged expectations and embodied a different kind of fearlessness, one that combined skill, strategy, and sheer audacity. Shield maidens, or skjaldmør, occupy the most famous role in popular imagination. Figures like Lagertha, Brynhildr, and Hervor leap from the pages of saga literature, capturing the imagination with their prowess. But while their stories are dramatized, they reflect a broader cultural truth. Norse society did not strictly prohibit women from combat. The sagas suggest that it was not unusual for women of high status to receive some martial training, and in times of crisis, many may have taken up arms to defend home and kin. The Birka burial in Sweden, discovered in the 21st century, provides the most tangible evidence. Genetic analysis revealed that a high-ranking warrior, interred with full weaponry and honored as a leader, was female. Her grave goods, 2 horses, a sword, axe, spear, and gaming pieces imply that she was both a fighter and a strategist. She was no symbolic figure. She commanded respect in life, and was buried accordingly. This discovery reshapes our understanding of women's roles, proving that at least some fought as equals to men. Yet combat was not the sole arena where Viking women displayed martial skill. During raids and defensive actions, women often acted as scouts, archers, or defenders of fortifications. In some sagas, they rally villagers to resist invaders, employing tactical knowledge inherited from observing male kin or through their own experience. Courage in battle was inseparable from cleverness. The Vikings admired cunning as much as strength. The psychological warfare of the Viking woman was equally formidable. In several sagas, Women provoked men into action or revenge through sharp words, manipulation, or displays of resolve. This verbal acuity could determine the course of feuds inside armies or turn potential defeat into victory. In this sense, the battlefield was not always defined by steel. It could be dominated by wit, influence, and fearlessness of spirit. Viking women also contributed to raids indirectly, managing supplies, ships, and intelligence. They oversaw the home front, ensuring men could leave for long expeditions with provisions, repaired weapons, and knowledge of the terrain. Women's understanding of land and sea routes could inform strategies, helping warriors avoid ambushes or locate key targets. Their logistical and strategic contributions, though invisible in battle chronicles, were vital to the success of military campaigns. Even in domestic defense, women demonstrated fearlessness. Homes and longhouses were vulnerable during a man's absence. Historical accounts and sagas describe women defending settlements against raiders, sometimes wielding axes, knives, or whatever tools were at hand. They coordinated household thralls, organized resistance, and used intimate knowledge of the landscape to their advantage. Courage in these cases was practical and immediate, tied directly to survival. Yet it is crucial to recognize that not all women fought physically. The Norse concept of bravery encompassed moral courage, endurance, and resilience as much as martial prowess. Women negotiating alliances, managing estates, or standing firm in the face of death were equally lauded for their fearlessness. The sagas celebrate this broad definition, suggesting a society that valued strength in its many forms. The fearlessness of Viking women, therefore, was multidimensional. Some wielded weapons and commanded troops, others shaped destinies from hearth and hall. All operated within a culture that respected courage, whether expressed on the battlefield, in the council, or through steadfast action in everyday life. Even when Christianization and later societal changes attempted to limit their visibility, the sagas and archaeological record preserve glimpses of women who could defy convention and confront danger without hesitation. Ultimately, Viking women at war, whether with sword, mind, or will, embody a fearlessness that is both literal and symbolic. They remind us that courage is not confined to a single form, and that the legacy of these women is more complex and enduring than myths of shield maidens alone suggest. They stood, they acted, they endured, and their stories, half hidden and half legendary, continue to inspire. Their bravery is a mirror of the Viking ethos, to meet life, death, and destiny with unflinching resolve, to wield one's influence with skill, and to carve a place in the world, regardless of the boundaries imposed by others. Whether on the battlefield or in the halls of power, Viking women were fearless in ways that defined their age and echo into ours. While tales of shield maidens and matriarchs dominate the imagination, the day-to-day bravery of Viking women often unfolded in quieter, yet no less perilous, arenas, markets, trade routes, and voyages across uncharted waters. Fearlessness, for these women, took the form of enterprise, endurance, and adaptability. Where men might command ships or armies, women commanded commerce, influence, and survival, shaping both local communities and distant networks. Markets in Hedeby, Rye, Birka, and beyond were bustling centers of exchange, and women were integral to their operation. They bartered furs, cloth, food, and jewelry, often negotiating deals that spanned hundreds of miles. Some were professional merchants, others managed the household surplus. Regardless of status, their acumen affected both wealth and reputation. In a society where trade could secure alliances or provoke envy, women's skill at negotiation and appraisal could alter the fortunes of entire families. Travel was inherently dangerous. Roads were treacherous, rivers unpredictable, and seas unforgiving. Viking women who journeyed with family or alone faced the same threats as men: storms, bandits, and the unknown. Yet the sagas describe women undertaking such journeys with courage and ingenuity. Of the deep-minded, for instance, voyaged from the Orkneys to Iceland as a widow, guiding her kin and thralls to safety while navigating unfamiliar waters. She was a leader, a navigator, and a guardian, her courage literal and practical. Along trade routes, women acted as cultural intermediaries. Marriages arranged between distant clans or communities were often accompanied by women who traveled with goods, knowledge, and social protocols. They carried the customs, languages, and traditions of their homelands, facilitating trust and commerce in unfamiliar territories. Their mobility helped forge networks that extended the reach of Norse society far beyond the northern seas, linking Scandinavia with the British Isles, the Baltic, Russia, and even Byzantium. Commerce, however, carried its own dangers. Wealth attracted attention, and women traveling with goods risked robbery or abduction. They needed courage, strategy, and sometimes martial skill to navigate these threats. Some carried weapons. Others relied on clever tactics or alliances to ensure safe passage. The combination of resourcefulness and boldness in trade and travel mirrored the courage found on the battlefield, though expressed differently. In settlement colonies such as Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroes, women were often responsible for establishing the economic foundation of new communities. They managed farms, livestock, and supplies, ensuring that food and resources could withstand harsh climates. They taught skills to children and thralls alike, preserving knowledge essential to survival. A woman's ability to endure winters, tend the sick, and maintain productivity directly affected the colony's viability. Beyond practical enterprise, Viking women's travel and trade also carried symbolic power. They embodied the reach of Norse culture and its adaptability. Through clothing, jewelry, and household goods, they introduced Scandinavian styles abroad, and through their stories and rituals, they preserved Norse identity in foreign lands. In effect, each journey was a combination of commerce, cultural transmission, and survival, demanding courage, intelligence, and foresight. Even for those who remained at home, the mental and logistical demands were intense. Managing households while men were away on raids or trading expeditions required organization, resilience, and authority. Women directed labor, collected tribute, and ensured security against rival clans. Their fearlessness manifested not in dramatic gestures, but in steady leadership, a quiet courage that sustained families and communities across long absences and uncertain times. Viking women's mobility and trade influence also intersected with family and politics. By marrying strategically or arranging alliances, women could extend influence beyond local settlements. A merchant bride moving to a new region carried with her both economic potential and political weight, weaving a network that could strengthen or stabilize a clan. Her decisions, often invisible in the records of male warriors, shaped the geopolitical landscape in subtle but profound ways. Trade, travel, and domestic management together created a sphere where Viking women exercised autonomy and power, sometimes equal to or surpassing men. Their courage was multifaceted. It combined endurance, intellect, and decisiveness, demonstrating that heroism was not confined to battle. Women who navigated storms, markets, and distant lands embodied a fearlessness that ensured the survival and prosperity of their kin, their communities, and even their culture. Through commerce and travel, Viking women left a legacy that was both practical and symbolic. They carried wealth, skills, stories, and customs across continents, shaping the North's interactions with the wider world. Their presence and initiative ensured that Norse society could adapt, expand, and endure, demonstrating that courage often lies in persistence, resourcefulness, and the willingness to venture into the unknown. Fearlessness, in this context, was not about facing death alone on a battlefield. It was about confronting uncertainty, taking calculated risks, and asserting agency in every corner of life, economic, social, and cultural. In every trade route and settlement, Viking women proved that valor could be quiet yet transformative, personal yet far-reaching, shaping history as surely as any sword. While warriors wielded swords and raiders carried axes, Viking women wielded knowledge of the body, the herbs, and the unseen forces that governed life and death. In a world where sickness, injury, and childbirth could claim lives with terrifying speed, women's expertise in healing was indispensable. Their fearlessness was expressed in acts that demanded skill, intuition, and courage, often under conditions as perilous as any battlefield. Midwifery was among the most respected and dangerous roles. Bringing a child into the world required more than hands. It demanded courage, composure, and a deep understanding of human physiology. Complications were common, and the risks to both mother and infant were extreme. A midwife's decisions could mean life or death, and yet these women labored without hesitation, often far from assistance, armed only with knowledge passed down through generations. The likeness healers or herbalists combined practical medicine with spiritual insight. They treated wounds, fevers, and ailments using herbs, poultices, and oils. Willow bark for pain, juniper for cleansing, and yarrow to staunch bleeding were staples of their repertoire. Women cultivated, harvested, and prepared these remedies, preserving traditions that blended observation, experience, and intuition. They understood that healing was both physical and emotional, requiring patience, empathy, and decisiveness. Magic, or sire, often intersected with medicine. Women who practiced it were called upon to protect households, bless crops, or predict outcomes of ventures. While men often shunned sire for its association with sorcery, women employed it as a form of social, spiritual, and practical power. A healer who could calm fever, ease childbirth, or foresee danger wielded influence and respect. Fearlessness in this domain meant facing the unknown, the invisible currents of disease, the whims of fate, the delicate balance between life and death without flinching. The combination of medical skill and magical practice was not purely theoretical. In times of war or migration, women treated injuries from battle, illness from travel, and malnutrition during famine. Their work required improvisation, herbs from forests, tools fashioned from limited materials, and remedies tested in urgent conditions. A misstep could be fatal, yet these women acted decisively, guided by knowledge, intuition, and courage. Healing also carried social and moral weight. Women often acted as mediators between the living and the dead, performing rites to honor ancestors or ease spirits. They maintained the balance between physical health and spiritual well-being, embodying a holistic understanding of life that combined observation with reverence. In doing so, they ensured not just survival but continuity of community, family, and culture. Some women extended their influence further, becoming advisors to rulers and warriors on matters of health and fate. The sagas recount instances where queens and noble women recommended treatments, interpreted omens, or advised on strategic timing based on both observation and intuition. Their counsel could sway decisions that affected battles, alliances, and the lives of thousands. Knowledge, in this context, was power, and wielding it required courage. Women risked their reputations and, at times, their safety. A healer accused of practicing forbidden magic could face ostracism or execution, yet they persisted, guided by necessity, expertise, and a conviction that their work preserved life and legacy. Even ordinary women practiced forms of healing in their households. They tended sick children, cared for aging relatives, and treated minor injuries from farming or domestic accidents. In a society where survival depended on cooperation, skill, and foresight, these acts of daily courage were as vital as any raid or battle. The fearlessness of Viking women in medicine and magic demonstrates a profound understanding of the interconnectedness of life. Their actions were guided by knowledge, intuition, and responsibility. They confronted the limits of human ability, the caprice of fate, and the shadow of death, yet continued their work with determination and care. Through their hands, communities survived, children thrived, and traditions endured. Their legacy is evident in archaeological finds, from amulets and herbal containers to skeletal evidence of care, and in the continued stories of women as healers and wise counselors. Viking women's courage in this realm reminds us that heroism is not always public, nor is it measured by violence or conquest. Sometimes it is expressed quietly in the preservation of life, the comfort of the sick, and the fearless application of knowledge against the ever-present threat of mortality. In healing, women shaped history as profoundly as any warrior. Their fearlessness lay in the mastery of knowledge, the commitment to care, and the willingness to confront life's most delicate, dangerous, and essential battles. Those fought not on the field, but at the bedside, in the wilderness, and within the human body itself. While the sword and the ship carried Vikings across seas and battlefields, it was the stories, songs, and sagas that carried the spirit of the North through generations. In this sphere, women held a unique and formidable power, the ability to preserve history, culture, and identity. Their fearlessness was expressed not in the clash of steel but in the courage to remember, to teach, and to shape the narrative of a people. Viking society placed immense value on memory and oral tradition. Before the widespread use of written language, stories were the vessels of law, history, and morality. Women, as mothers, midwives, and household heads, were often the first and most influential storytellers. They narrated the sagas of gods and heroes, instilled knowledge of lineage, and taught children their rights, responsibilities, and place in the world. In doing so, they shaped both individual identity and communal cohesion. This role was not passive. To remember was to wield power. A woman who recited the deeds of ancestors or the laws of her clan ensured that society's values endured. Forgetting or misrepresenting events could alter claims to property, influence disputes, or even spark feuds. Therefore, storytelling required precision, discernment, and a fearless commitment to truth as she knew it. Her memory was both a shield and a sword, preserving honor and guiding action. Beyond the family, women's influence extended to public gatherings. In the Thing, assemblies of free men and families, women could act as witnesses, mediators, or advisors. Their testimony, rooted in detailed knowledge of events and kinship, carried authority. A woman's recollection could determine the outcome of legal disputes, land claims, or negotiations. In these arenas, fearlessness meant standing firm, speaking clearly, and defending what was right in the face of potential challenge or intimidation. Sagas also immortalize women as creators of poetry and song. Skaldic tradition, dominated by men in public performances, still depended on women to nurture and preserve the oral culture at home. They composed lullabies, commemorated family achievements, and adapted stories to teach moral lessons. Poetry and song were not mere entertainment. They were vessels of wisdom and tools of cultural continuity. The courage required to compose and perform these works lay in the responsibility of accurately representing history, fate, and societal values. Women were also keepers of ritual knowledge and seasonal customs. Through festivals, rites, and ceremonies, they maintained the rhythm of the community and ensured continuity with ancestral practices. The festivals of Yule, Midsummer, and Harvest were guided by women's hands, voices, and memory, linking the present to a lineage that spanned centuries. Through these acts, they exercised influence over the spiritual and cultural life of their society, reinforcing norms and beliefs that kept communities cohesive and resilient. Moreover, women preserved moral and ethical teachings embedded in the sagas. Stories of vengeance, loyalty, honor, and sacrifice were not just entertainment. They were lessons in fearlessness, responsibility, and courage. By transmitting these values to children, women ensured that the ethos of the North endured, shaping warriors, rulers, and citizens alike. Their work required conviction, discernment, and the bravery to teach truth even when it challenged prevailing practices or personal interests. Even in exile or colonization, Viking women carried culture across the seas. In Greenland, Iceland, and Vinland, they maintained language, traditions, and oral history, keeping the memory of the North alive in unfamiliar lands. They taught children songs, runes, and stories of gods and ancestors, ensuring that even on distant shores, Norse identity survived. Their fearlessness lay in preserving identity against isolation, adversity, and the erosion of memory. Importantly, the cultural courage of Viking women was not always recognized in written history. Chronicles often highlight male warriors and kings, but the enduring cultural influence of women shaped the society in ways that were no less profound. Their acts of memory, storytelling, and teaching ensured that the values, customs, and lessons of the past informed every generation. This form of fearlessness, intellectual, moral, and cultural, reveals a dimension of power often invisible yet essential. Women who safeguarded tradition were, in effect, architects of resilience. They bore the weight of history, the responsibility of lineage, and the moral guidance of the community. In their steadiness, they demonstrated that courage is as much about endurance, clarity, and fidelity to truth as it is about combat. Through the hearth, the song, and the spoken word, Viking women forged a legacy that outlived raids, invasions, and the fading of the old gods. Their fearlessness was quiet, pervasive, and enduring, ensuring that the spirit of the North was never lost, carried forward in the voices of generations who would rise to claim their place in the world. In remembering, teaching, and preserving, Viking women showed that fearlessness is not only about facing external dangers, it is about confronting time itself, preserving identity, and ensuring that the heart of a culture continues to beat long after individual lives have passed. While sagas often spotlight individual courage and familial duty, another dimension of Viking women's fearlessness lay in their relationships with one another. In a harsh world defined by winters, by long voyages, and intermittent violence, solidarity among women was a quiet but formidable force. It provided emotional support, practical aid, and strategic alliances, allowing them to endure hardships and exercise influence in ways men alone could not. From the earliest childhood, Viking girls learned the value of collaboration. Sisters, cousins, and close friends shared chores, farm labor, and domestic responsibilities, often teaching one another critical skills in spinning, weaving, and household management. These activities required dexterity, concentration, and endurance, but they also cultivated mutual reliance. In an era when survival depended on collective effort, the bonds between women were both practical and protective. In marriage and motherhood, these relationships extended outward. Women advised one another on childbirth, child-rearing, and health remedies, passing down wisdom that was literally life-saving. Midwifery, in particular, was rarely a solitary endeavor. Experienced mothers or a village's elder women often guided young mothers through difficult labors, combining empirical knowledge with ritual and incantation. Courage in these moments was not the absence of fear but the willingness to act decisively under pressure, relying on one another's support. Friendship also carried political and strategic significance. Women of noble families formed networks that could influence alliances, marriages, and property rights. Such alliances were often cemented through ritualized gift-giving, shared religious observances, or joint participation in feasts and gatherings. The strength of these networks could stabilize regions or create opportunities for negotiation and mediation. In essence, women's friendships were both emotional lifelines and instruments of subtle power. The sagas and historical records hint at the depth of this solidarity. When one woman's family was threatened by feud or misfortune, others often stepped in to mediate, advocate, or provide refuge. In Iceland, widows or unmarried women frequently formed informal support groups, collectively managing resources, defending property, or caring for children. Their cooperation reinforced resilience and safeguarded continuity in times of instability. This communal courage extended to defense as well. During raids or attacks, women often organized their own resistance. They coordinated household defenses, managed stores of weapons, and sometimes took active roles in repelling intruders. Though these actions are less glorified than battles led by men, they were no less vital to survival. Solidarity allowed women to confront danger with confidence, knowing they were not alone. In spiritual life, too, solidarity mattered. Shared rituals, festivals, and prayers reinforced community bonds, linking women to one another across households and settlements. Together, they observed rites of passage, honored ancestors, and maintained the rhythms of life in alignment with both pagan and Christian traditions. These communal acts strengthened identity, morale, and psychological resilience, enabling women to face adversity with composed determination. The emotional aspect of this solidarity cannot be overstated. The harsh climate, high mortality, and political instability of the Viking world required emotional fortitude. Women drew courage from one another's presence, shared grief, and mutual encouragement. The ability to sustain hope, provide comfort, and maintain morale within a household or settlement was an act of fearless leadership in its own right. Even in the context of exile or colonization, these networks endured. Settlers in Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland relied on mutual aid among women to maintain food supplies, tend livestock, and ensure the survival of children. The cohesion fostered through these relationships allowed new communities to take root in unfamiliar and often hostile environments. The fearlessness of Viking women, therefore, was amplified by their solidarity. Individual courage was magnified when combined with shared wisdom, mutual protection, and emotional support. Sisterhood, friendship, and communal bonds created a social fabric strong enough to endure external threats, internal conflict, and the hardships of a changing world. In this way, Viking women demonstrate that courage is not only an individual attribute but a collective practice. Fearlessness manifests in the strength to care, protect, and lead within networks of trust and mutual reliance. Through solidarity, women shaped survival, influenced society, and ensured that the culture of the North endured, woven together not by swords alone, but by shared lives and shared courage. The legacy of these bonds reminds us that true fearlessness often lies in connection, in the capacity to support and be supported, and in the understanding that survival and influence are achieved together, not in isolation. Viking women, through friendship and communal strength, carved a place for themselves in history that was both enduring and transformative. Beyond hearth and kinship, beyond battlefield and trade, Viking women exerted influence in realms often invisible but profoundly consequential: leadership, diplomacy, and negotiation. In a society that valued honor, reputation, and strategic thinking, the capacity to shape outcomes without wielding a sword was itself an act of fearlessness. Viking women mastered the arts of persuasion, timing, and subtle authority, using intellect and social insight to navigate a world dominated by men. Queens, noblewomen, and even some commoners exercised power through counsel and decision-making. Their understanding of family dynamics, alliances, and obligations made them indispensable advisors. A woman's word could mediate feuds, resolve disputes, and guide political decisions that affected entire communities or regions. In these roles, fearlessness meant speaking truth to power, acting decisively in tense situations, and accepting responsibility for the consequences of one's guidance. Marriage, as much as battle, was a domain where strategic acumen defined influence. Women negotiated dowries, arranged alliances, and mediated between families. These negotiations required insight into human nature, patience, and the ability to project both authority and tact. A miscalculation could spark conflict. A wise choice could strengthen bonds, preserve honor, and secure the welfare of descendants. Women who excelled in these negotiations were recognized for their courage, for diplomacy demanded as much boldness as combat. Viking women also played critical roles in succession and governance. In the sagas, widowed queens or matriarchs frequently served as regents, guiding heirs through turbulent times. They administered estates, managed military resources, and ensured continuity in leadership. Their fearlessness manifested in the willingness to assume responsibility during crises, to make decisions under pressure, and to assert authority in environments where their legitimacy might be questioned. Communication, persuasion, and reputation were the tools of their trade. Women who mastered rhetoric and social intelligence could sway chieftains, settle disputes between families, or influence council decisions. The sagas record instances where a queen's counsel prevented violence or brokered peace, demonstrating that soft power was no less vital than the strength of arms. Fearlessness here meant daring to act decisively, to speak firmly, and to maintain moral and social authority. Even outside formal leadership, Viking women influenced society through public presence and ritual. Participation in ceremonies, festivals, and religious rites allowed them to reinforce social norms and assert communal values. Through storytelling, song, and ritual performance, women guided collective understanding of justice, honor, and duty. Their actions shaped the ethical framework of society, subtly influencing behavior and decisions. Women's influence also extended to international affairs. In marriages arranged between different clans or kingdoms, they often acted as cultural and political intermediaries. Their counsel and diplomacy could ease tensions, strengthen alliances, and ensure mutual understanding. Traveling with goods, letters, or instructions, these women facilitated communication and reinforced relationships across vast distances. In these roles, courage was expressed in adaptability, foresight, and the capacity to act in unfamiliar and sometimes dangerous environments. The sagas emphasize that fearlessness in these domains was inseparable from wisdom. A woman's effectiveness depended not on brute force, but on observation, judgment, and the moral authority she commanded. She needed insight into human motives, awareness of political dynamics, and a willingness to take calculated risks. Her courage was subtle but enduring, shaping outcomes over months and years, often with consequences as significant as a victory in battle. Even as Christianity spread and societal structures shifted, the influence of Viking women persisted. Their roles adapted but did not disappear. Leadership, diplomacy, and negotiation remained avenues where women exercised autonomy and power. Their legacy illustrates that fearlessness is not always loud or visible. It can reside in skillful action, moral courage, and the strategic shaping of events in ways that ensure survival, stability, and prosperity. In sum, the subtle power wielded by Viking women reveals a dimension of their fearlessness that complements the more visible acts of bravery in battle or exploration. It is the courage to act decisively in social, political, and diplomatic arenas, the boldness to speak truth, guide outcomes, and assume responsibility, and the insight to influence events across generations. Through these arts of influence, Viking women left an indelible mark on their world, shaping history with intellect, will, and unwavering courage. Their legacy reminds us that leadership and bravery take many forms, and that fearlessness often thrives where strategy, moral authority, and courage intersect. Viking women mastered these arts, proving that power does not always require a sword and that influence, once wielded wisely, can endure for centuries. As the Viking Age waned, and the longships of raiders gave way to settled communities and Christian kingdoms, the fearlessness of Viking women did not vanish. It transformed, adapted, and persisted. Their legacy is not only recorded in sagas and archaeology but also in the enduring influence they exerted on family, society, and culture. The lives they led, the choices they made, and the courage they displayed continued to shape generations long after the age of Vikings had ended. The transition from paganism to Christianity in Scandinavia created both challenges and opportunities for women. Some found their spiritual authority diminished as the church discouraged or condemned the practices of midwives, healers, and seeresses. Yet, even in these changes, Viking women adapted their roles. They merged old traditions with new beliefs, incorporating Christian rituals while preserving the knowledge and cultural memory of their ancestors. This adaptability was itself an expression of fearlessness, the courage to survive cultural upheaval while retaining identity and agency. In domestic life, Viking women continued to hold sway. They managed households, supervised farms, and maintained family honor. Even as political power shifted to men or to external authorities, women ensured the continuity of resources, traditions, and social bonds. Their stewardship over households and land preserved the stability of communities through turbulent times, demonstrating that leadership need not always be public to be profound. The spiritual and intellectual influence of Viking women endured as well. They preserved oral traditions, sang songs of gods and heroes, and told stories that taught morality, resilience, and courage. In these narratives, they immortalized the values of their society, shaping cultural memory and ensuring that the ethos of the North survived in the hearts and minds of successive generations. Fearlessness here was moral and cultural, the courage to assert the importance of memory, story, and identity in a world changing rapidly around them. Viking women's contributions to exploration and colonization also left lasting legacies. They accompanied settlers to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, where their skills in survival, household management, and diplomacy were essential. In these distant lands, women preserved customs, language, and legal traditions, ensuring that Norse culture endured even at the edge of the known world. Their fearlessness was evident in their willingness to face the unknown, confront adversity, and guide families through new and often unforgiving environments. Archaeological evidence continues to illuminate the breadth of Viking women's influence. Graves with weapons, tools, and ornaments demonstrate not only social status, but also the recognition of their roles as leaders, traders, and warriors. Inscriptions, artifacts, and genetic analyses reveal their participation in warfare, trade, and settlement, challenging earlier assumptions that women were confined solely to domestic spheres. This evidence confirms what the sagas long suggested. Viking women were active agents in shaping their world. The courage of Viking women resonates beyond their immediate historical context. Their ability to balance multiple roles, mother, healer, leader, negotiator, trader, and sometimes warrior, provides a model of multifaceted bravery. They faced dangers, both physical and social, navigated complex relationships, and preserved culture and knowledge under difficult circumstances. Their legacy teaches that fearlessness is not limited to grandiose acts of valor. It is also expressed in endurance, intelligence, and moral resolve. Even today, the stories of Viking women inspire. They remind us that influence is not always overt, that courage can be subtle, and that resilience in the face of uncertainty is a form of heroism. The women of the North demonstrate that leadership, ingenuity, and fearlessness can manifest in many forms, shaping societies and leaving echoes that endure through centuries. In the final measure, Viking women were fearless because they acted with purpose, guided by wisdom, loyalty, and vision. Whether defending their homes, preserving culture, managing estates, healing the sick, negotiating alliances, or raising future generations, they carved paths of influence and survival in a world as harsh as the northern seas. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of women in history, a courage that is quiet yet unyielding, practical yet profound, immediate yet timeless. Viking women remind us that fearlessness is not only about facing enemies, but also about shaping the world, guiding the future, and preserving the past with unwavering determination. In every song sung, every saga told, and every artifact preserved, The echoes of their bravery persist, proof that the spirit of the Viking woman is immortal, fearless, and endlessly inspiring.